You flick my balls, I'll flick yours.
Yeah, the spot.
Hi, I'm Andy,
And I'm Roger,
and welcome to The Middle,
where we try to have thoughtful conversations
about awkward topics.
on our search to find the middle.
We're going to give you last week's news today.
It's a slogan we should put on a t-shirt.
Stop touching her!
I am tonight announcing my candidacy.
Taylor Swift.
Look, my biggest issue with marriage is that I think that it's a fundamentally flawed institution that is built on the oppression of women.
I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny.
Having truly rational conversations about controversial issues is risky these days.
Roger.
Andy, how you doing?
Oh, pretty good. What you been up to? You're in ketosis, I hear.
Wow. You know me. I think this dieting or this health challenge that we've picked up, I guess, well, I've kind of done it off the back of you doing it, right? And I've had so many false starts and I've tried so many different things. I thought, what the hell? None of it seems to be working because I have no self-control or resilience at this point in time. So I'm like, I'm going to try keto. I'm going to try, because I had a couple of really bombastic and charming influences on my feed at the moment, and they're all like versions of carnivore or keto. And I don't know, maybe them just shouting at me constantly when I open my phone has now made me decide to give keto diet a try. So those who don't know, keto diet essentially is a diet that consists of limiting your carbs to probably less than about 30 grams a day. And it puts you into the state called ketogenesis, and the whole point of it is to actually move the way that your body feeds your brain and your energy from glucose, which it prefers, so it breaks down carbs into simple sugars, glucose, to moving it to using fat instead. And it's something the body is like a natural adaptation the body has when carbs are scarce and you're in a starvation-like mode. And your liver produces these things called ketones, and that's essentially what allows you to survive off no carbs. So that's kind of, you pretty much, you limit your carbs, and somewhere between day 3 and day 4, you go into the state called ketosis, where your body is now eating your fat to essentially create your energy. And you find that out by pissing on these little strips. They look very similar to the type you put into the pool to find out whether your pool water is has the right acidity and things like that. And then you kind of try to match the color and tells you in your ketosis.
So what you're saying is that you can take a bottle of piss to the pool shop and they'll tell you what foods you can eat?
No, I'm going way riskier than that. I'm just looking at the bottle. But yeah, it's interesting. And I think a lot of these diets, obviously, there's heavily restricted diets and things like that, work because they break the cycle of you eating crappy food, essentially, right?
I think, is it off the wagon, on the wagon, off the wagon? Off the wagon is the bad, whatever the bad one is. Yeah, I'm back to not 3 meals a day, but 2 meals a day, and they're usually pretty indulgent meals. And as we were discussing before we hit record, I made donuts today, so that gives you an idea where my diet's at. And
never trust a skinny chef, mate.
and the other thing is my scales have run out of batteries, so I need to get one of those. The kind of batteries I hate the most are those little round ones, because the
CR2032s.
It's like they're so hard to, like, you can't just, you never have them in the drawer like you do the AAA, AA, those kind of ones. And then also they tend, because they're like button batteries and kids can choke on them and stuff, they usually have like a little bit more kind of difficulty to open where the battery's stored. So they've got like screws. You're going to go get a screwdriver just to work out even what battery to buy, because there's lots of different types of the circular ones. And so even just to know what battery you need to go and buy to replace, it's all too hard. So yeah, I need to pull my finger out. So what are we talking about today?
We thought we'd kind of take it back to something a little bit more playful, and something that we could have some funny, hopefully not too tense conversations with our listeners and the community. And, maybe we should have done this closer to a Men's Health Day itself. But essentially the title of this episode is really, hard times and hard for men. So we are going to have a go at saying, a bit of tongue-in-cheek, but a lot of it true, our top 5 reasons for why it's hard to be a man in 2024.
Do you know what, the way you introduce that, as though you have to almost defend yourself and we have to defend ourselves for having a conversation about the challenges that men face. Isn't that like number one, right? That no one takes any kind of hardship that men face seriously. It's like you have to almost explain it away as, oh, we're just having a bit of a laugh and a bit of a joke.
Look, I think it's what people hear in the opening that will immediately turn them off, right? And people are just so their attention is so poor right now in this day and age that if we didn't do that, not only would they not respond to the episode, but they may just write us off forever.
Can I ask, before we get into it, what's the opposite of a feminist?
Yeah, I guess it's a men's rights activist.
A men's rights activist.
I was about to say show,
or a misogynist.
But, I was about to say.
But there isn't, right? There's no male equivalent.
Well,
except,
I mean, critics would say it's for the same reason that there's no straight day.
Yeah, but like I think feminism is a pretty broad church, right? There's lots of space in feminism to.
Well, it's not that broad apparently if you are trans.
No. Well, there's branches of feminism that one branch is tolerant of
I'm not
trans
sure if you
women
could define it as a branch, maybe a twig.
but like I think more generally, right, when women today talk about being feminist, they don't just mean that they'll go out and march for like equal rights, like, you know, maybe what feminism was 100 years ago or 50 years ago or whatever. It's a broader suite of like philosophy relating to what it is to be a woman or so on, right? Where at least for some subset of it, there could be an equivalent, you know, contemplation of equivalent issues for men, but like it's just it's a combination of like, firstly, men don't introspect in that way about themselves to then have a philosophy called, I don't know, what masculine. I'm a masculinist, right? That's not a thing. And then the other words you have is like misogynist, which is then, you know, has all the negative connotations. A little bit different, right? It's not the same thing, right?
Andy, that's why it was so easy for Andrew Tate to take over. There was a big gap in the market.
All right. So how are we going to do this?
I will say that, look, we haven't spoken and planned what our top 5 is. This is not some curated BuzzFeed. It's really just a bit of a skeleton for us to have a conversation, and you can make them playful or serious. So let's have a conversation. And I think the thing too that I'll set up with mine is that I've actually done a little bit of field listening. I've done a few Vox Pops. I've talked to a few people. So not all of these are mine, if you know what I mean. Like, this is kind of what I'm hearing as well. And sometimes I'll take someone else's story just to, you know, put that out there.
So we're going to give our top 5 biggest challenges for being a man in 2024. Is that right?
Yeah. We're going to be more triggering than that. Why it's hard to be a man.
Why it's hard to be a man. All right. I'm going to start with, I do have a list, but I think we're not doing it in any particular order. So I'm just going to do it randomly. I'm going to start with what I think is the most obvious one, which is that men die earlier than women. So for whatever injustice that, you know, women might sort of say that, you know, that they face challenges or they face hurdles or they face struggles that men don't face, right? So for whatever those things are, at the end of the day, men live shorter lives. Like, that's a universal trait across virtually every society and every culture, right?
Isn't it weird, though? It's not just like men taking unnecessary risks, although, you know, there's a part of that drives the statistic, but it's actually just take 2 sedentary humans, male and female, and the males still die significantly sooner than the females, right?
Well, I don't even think it really matters, right? So the typical response to this point will be, well, firstly, that's because men are more violent, so that's your fault, right? It's the fault of men that if they die from violence or if they take risks, that's their fault. Even health, like, there's stats around, you know, women are more likely to get, go and get a health checkup, or they're more likely to, if they're concerned about something to do with their health, to seek medical advice than men, whereas men sort of have a she'll be right attitude kind of thing. Ironic for the episode. And therefore, like, these are factors that account for the difference in life expectations. But I don't know that really matters, because if there are traits intrinsic in being a man that make you psychologically less inclined to do that, or if you're psychologically more inclined to take risks, or whatever, like it's a little bit like, it doesn't really matter what the factors are. Like at the end of the day, it's the outcome that's different. And we're not talking about like a very small age gap too. It can be quite significant. It could be like years, right?
Yeah. Look, yeah, I agree. I think that it's hard not to tally up all the chips at the end of the day, and that to be a fairly knockout blow in some ways. You know, I don't think it's quite long enough for it to be like there's another life afterwards for women in most cases. But I tend to agree.
But like even if it's, let's just say for argument's sake, it's in the order of, I mean, it's probably less than this, but let's say it were 5%, right? Let's say women live 5% longer lives than men, right? Then if women come at men with like the gender pay gap, for example, say, oh, women get paid 5% less on average. It's like, well, you live 5% longer lives. Surely that, and usually when
you've just fallen into the trap, Andy. They live longer lives, so they need more money.
Well, usually when we talk about the gender pay gap, you can at least argue it as like, well, there's actually, possibly some different things going on, and it's not outright discrimination or whatever. It is one of those black and white areas where it's absolutely a disparity, and it's a disparity that isn't talked about. Like maybe just to bring in like an example of where it doesn't get talked about, like suicide. Like men are more vulnerable to suicide. Suicide rates for men are much higher than for women, and that's an example of, and that plays into one of the reasons why life expectancy is higher for women than for men. But it's these sorts of things which often don't get talked about in a broader landscape of men and women, equitable outcomes.
No, that's a good one to kick us off, because I think it gives us room to move. Now, I've got lots to build on that, but I'm going to go something quite different just to give a bit of variety, and we can double back. And mine's going to go a little bit lighthearted. My reason that it's hard to be a man, I'm going to go for a defining feature of men, and don't come at me, trans community. This is just for the episode. It comes in under the category of balls. Now, balls, man, like think about it, right? You've got these big old things between your legs. They're kind of hanging there, just doing their business. They're sensitive. They're not protected. They get in the way. This is something unique to the male experience. Getting hit in the balls. Could there not be anything more unique in terms of the pain? It's actually like a really good metaphor for a lot of things about being a man, right? Like if you get hit in the balls, right, and your partner or your wife or your sister is there, they don't give a shit. They literally, like, they can't understand what it feels like, and they just always think that you're being a wuss. And it's just a really strange thing, because like, obviously they cannot understand what it's like to be hitting the balls in the right angle, that right little flick on the right part of the balls.
What are you doing, flick?
Yeah, just like, I don't know, like hasn't your kid ever just come up and like punched you or slapped you, and they've just got you in the right kind of thing?
Do you think it's the equivalent of like, how like, well, obviously men can't experience childbirth, right? So it's just one of those things where because you can't experience it, we can like play it up to be anything we like, right? We've got a blank check on this thing, right? So we can we can really say, you've got no idea how bad this is, right?
Well, you can't, right? Like that's something that is only afforded to men, right? But if you think about it, it holds your most precious asset, right? Your DNA, the ingredients for life, and the whole goal of your life lives in your balls. Yet they are so horribly protected as an animal, right?
Do you think that's like the evolutionary, just like basis for why that's the case?
I mean, it seems there's a lot of things on the human evolution thing where we've picked such a hard route, but the strongest have survived through that hard route. Whether it's infants who can't hold their own head up for, the first year of their life, or external genitalia and things like that.
All right, I'm going to take us out of the gutter.
All right.
So my next one for why it's hard to be a man is I'm going to go to relationships and dating. So I think there are distinct disadvantages to being a man in the sort of the traditional courtship sense of how it's all meant to happen socially, that is not recognized as being like a negative. So I think most women, they're like, let's just talk in cliches, because like here I think there is a diversity of experiences that it's a bit hard to kind of make blanket statements, but the cliche here is that, it's like women kind of dealing with these guys who, all suck, they're all losers or whatever, and they don't care about them. They only want, like a short thing just to get their, get their sugar hit, and then they run away kind of thing, right? Like you're listening to a Taylor Swift album. That's the cliche, right? But I don't know, maybe it's different now with Tinder and all the apps and stuff, but like certainly when we were coming of age, the way it worked was, it was the very clear expectation that, as the guy, you had to approach, like you had to be the one to initiate something, right? And that just sets up this whole dynamic where for guys, it's like the incentives, in fact, often the only way you can actually get something off the ground is to play some sort of a numbers game, right? Where the more you put yourself out there, the more risks you're willing to take, and like, for every 10 girls that you approach, you might get one, right? It's like fishing. You just got to like throw your sinker in, right? And then eventually you might get something, right?
Terrible phrasing, Andy.
So that whole dynamic is what gives rise to probably the negative experiences for women. But for women, on the flip side, that dynamic sets up this world of like, where they get approached all the time. So like, that's why they get sent dick pics all the time and stuff, because it's like, it's just the whole nature of it. And so on the one hand, like, that looks bad for men in that they're like kind of being, abusive really. But on the other hand, like, if you're not playing that game, so if you're a man and you're trying to uphold like good values or whatever, the game's not set up for you. And so you do have like a situation where heaps of like really good guys, they don't, maybe they're not willing to like have a crack, or they're not willing to sort of put themselves out there. And they're actually the guys that I think the women actually want. But because of the way it's all set up, and then girls are stuck with all the losers that don't treat them with respect. So anyway,
yeah,
that's
no, I think we've covered elements of this in previous episodes, but it's been shown in a lot of ways that the internet dating or the apps have really, it's not about men not having a crack as well. It's about the fact that like hyper sexualized chads have almost trained average women to behave a little bit differently. And so kind of no one wins in the end. And definitely, like you said, that the middle of men don't really have a place there, or they have to bend themselves into something that they hope is temporary to see any kind of results, right? It's like applying to an ad on Seek.com. You're just not going to get through without a reference. And I think the things you got to do to get a reference, you know what I mean? So, I tend to agree, and I think that it's a wider arc for me, that I think that if you look at the power dynamics in dating and relationships from, say, like the Mad Men era of coming, maturing into the 50s and the 60s to where we are now, and how we've traveled through here, we've gone through this reversal, this roller coaster where men used to have all the agency when it came to asking a girl out and all this kind of stuff, and being the first one to make a move, and what was expected there, to almost like, and I actually think it was the beginning of like the late 90s and the 2000s. Do you remember all those movies, those American kind of comedies like American Pie and all these rom-coms and things? They just painted this really rock-solid narrative of dorky coming-of-age men and women who were just like out of their league, put on a pedestal, and they had zero power, right? And in the end, they got together or whatever, but it was through almost like the sympathy of the leading woman. And I think that, the power reversal has really been completed in a lot of ways. But because of all these apps, like you said, it's returned to this kind of weird state of affairs. And I do think it's like that. In a lot of areas, probably men look back and they say, how the quote that they say where it's never been a better time to be a woman. The converse to that is it's actually never been worse to be a man in this way, because like a lot of those power shifts have occurred, and a lot of those dynamics have reversed to a more equitable stance. But as a result, your dollar's not going as far in all these different arenas, and like you said, that's one of them.
I think just not to give any currency to the whole like incel. If anyone hasn't heard of like incels, it's like involuntary celibate, which means they're basically unable to have a good relationship with women because not by choice but by just by not being able to find someone. But the whole like there's like online communities and all this, and they're quite like misogynist, and they attack women, and it's all women's fault that they can't get laid, kind of thing. So not to give any currency to that, but like I do think, there is like some aspect to that where, women, when they talk about how bad men are or whatever, that's like, there's like this pool of, like you mentioned before, like hyper, that there's like, it's at extremes of the distribution thing. So there's like, might be like 20% of the top 20%, in terms of like appeal of men that have multiple partners, and that, you only need to watch like Married at First Sight, right? You can see that in some of the people on that show, right? Where they're just, they're hitting it every night kind of thing, like every weekend, right? And they get used to that kind of mode. And then that's what women's like, that's what they're like experience with, especially younger women, like that's what they're experiencing. And they don't really see.
Maths women don't look too young to me.
Well, they're burned though, right? They're burned from these guys, right? Whereas once you like depart from that top, in terms of like, bed count, so to speak, and you depart away from that top sort of 20%, it gets a little bit more normal, and like there's actually probably, good blokes in that list, but they never get a crack.
All right, I'll go to my next one, and I'm going to call this one dirty jobs. One of the reasons I think that it's hard for men, and you don't really hear about it in the podcasting world as much, is the fact that essentially like the vast majority of dirty, dangerous jobs are done by men, right? Like literally look for a dirty job anywhere. There's a man doing it, right? And like I've obviously never seen a female waste disposal or garbage man. I mean, the fact that no one's complaining that it's a garbage person, not a garbage man, can give you like everything you need to know. The military obviously is heavily weighted to men, especially in physical combat roles. A lot of the sanitation, the rigging, the mining, some of that is changing. But look, a lot of that stuff, and there's also an expectation that men do it. So go closer to home. When there's dog shit in the yard, what's the expectation between men and women? You know what I mean? When there's a spider, when there's a dirty job to be done, right?
I had this on my list as well, but killing spiders. So you've beat me to the punch. I do think it's worth separating though the like the job market part of it, and then that latter part that the spiders or whatever, because the first category is, I don't think, quite the slam dunk that you make it out to be, in the sense that I think men tend to do more of those kind of jobs because they actually pay pretty good, right? Relative to the skills and, back experience, whatever training that you need, right? So I always remember being told by like a disgruntled primary school teacher when I was in, primary school that garbos earn more than teachers, right? And I think if that's still the case, or let's say it's near more or less the case, well, one, you have to go and do like 4 years of university training to do. The other you can just do if you're willing to do it, right? So, and I think that's the case also with like a lot of manual labor jobs and, things like that, where it's like, it's ugly, exhausting work, but you get paid well relative to the barriers to entry for those jobs, right? Yeah. And I think women kind of are excluded from some of those opportunities out of, could be a couple of reasons. It could be societal expectations that they don't do it. It could be the culture of the industries. So, it could be that, working on a building site, for example, is like often not the most friendly place for a woman, although I do think it's changing. So I think that there's some of those factors at play with the labour market kind of side of it, but I do agree that it is it is a phenomena. But where I think it comes out more perversely and more negatively for men is like, here's this shitty thing that has to be done, and you're going to have to do it because you're the man in the house. So whether it's, you gave the example of picking up dog shit from the front lawn, whether it's, taking the bins out or doing some really shitty task or catching the spider or the cockroach or whatever it is, right? It's like, you've got to do it because you're the man of the house. Like, I'm not doing it. So there's like this learned helplessness that you kind of have going on, right?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I take your point around there's obviously barriers to entry and things to the labour market, but and some of that is societal and systemic, maybe. But look, I think that all men maybe have a higher tolerance for intolerable workplaces. But, I don't think there are barriers to entry for women to go into waste management. But yeah, I don't know.
I'm next. So I'm going to, maybe this sort of is an extension of what we were talking about, but it's a different aspect to it, which is to say, and I think I'll die on the hill to argue for this one for anyone who disputes it, but at the margin, all other things being equal, it's harder to be a man today than a woman when it comes to things like recruitment, getting job opportunities, promotions, all those sorts of things, right? And it's 100% the case that if you have two candidates of absolute equal skills, experience, performance, capabilities, whatever metrics you want to use to say are relevant for the job or the opportunity or whatever we're talking about, if you've got a penis, you're not going to get the job. Unless you're a trans woman.
You won't believe this, and you can keep this in recording. But I just got a message from my partner saying there's a huge cockroach in the bathroom. You need to pause the recording and come now. So I'll be right back. Oh, Andy, sorry about that. It was a bit of a complex operation in the end. It was crawling in between the bath towels, and I had to shake it out and then try to trap it and get rid of it. Yeah.
So I think I was having a whinge about getting a job.
Oh, yeah. Oh, so I think this one is so controversial, and it's actually gotten me into trouble a few times with, on my side, because it's not a message that you want to hear, right? Like, as far as women are concerned, if you throw it back in their face that the reason, not even the reason why they've succeeded in any kind of corporate endeavor, but it's a factor on a grander scale, it's very challenging to them, because it's kind of taking away their agency and taking away that they have, they're self-made, and after fighting so long to have equal rights and equal opportunity and things like that, to almost have this bait and switch where it's like, oh, okay, now you're successful, but it wasn't actually your doing. You cruised through on affirmative action, right? And I think that's why it's so hard to hear, right? Like, even if I do generally agree, and I'll even go a step further, that I know 3 different corporate couples and literally choosing how they're going to invest and get the best bang for their buck. A lot of them have chosen to put their chips behind the woman because they have the better chance of breaking through and getting to an executive level than the man in the current environment, especially in my industry, where there's still a bit of a hangover and there's still lots of kind of, pale, stale white men at the top, and they're looking to even out their leadership teams and things like that, get some good press while they're at it. So they've chosen to go, okay, look, I'll back you, and you as the woman can actually try to break through to that executive level while I just kind of cruise here. So it's real. It's definitely real in certain industries, and the one that I'm kind of saying that is definitely real is that corporate environment, corporate kind of like white collar environment.
So I think it is probably important to be quite precise and clear in terms of I'll probably clarify what I'm saying and what I'm not saying, which is that if you look at the totality of discrimination and advantages, disadvantages that men and women face in the labour market or in a particular for a particular job or whatever, certainly women face a lot of uphill challenges that men don't face. So that's not to sort of suggest that those things aren't there. But once you reach like a pool of candidates that are, let's just say like for like they're pretty comparable. There's not really a lot of capacity to separate them. Let's say those other factors have given rise to a situation where there's, let's say, 70 men in that pool of candidates and then 30 women in that pool of candidates because, yeah, there's more men because they haven't, there's other factors explaining why there's only 30 women. It's going to be more competitive for the 70 men because probably in the end, if let's say there's 100 candidates going for 50 jobs, it's probably going to be 25 men and 25 women. So if you extend that analogy, you're probably going to have 25 out of the 30 women get the job and only 25 out of the 70 men get the job. So from the perspective of, the men who've got to the point where they're in that pool, in that upper echelon pool, right, looking for one of those 50 jobs out of the, that are available, it's going to be harder for them. So, and that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. No, look, it is what it is, right? And you have to, like everyone knows, you have to adapt and you have to do the best and play the hand you were dealt with, right? And there are ebbs and flows and things that come in and out of favor, right? Now, what is really egregious, and I've seen this actually twice, unquestioned, is when you get a female executive or leader and they go on just like a massive uncurtailed run of hiring only females. And this is something that I've seen probably about 3 times in my career. And I have to just sit back and say, wow, like obviously if it was a man doing this, it would be crazy. But because of the situation, I think it flies. So I've seen, these female teams just go, look, if I can find a qualified female to do the job, I'm going to do that every time. And you have these kind of like little power groups that come in and they're really tight, they're really cliquey. And it's just this modern marvel of where we are and in corporate life. And I think in a weird way, it makes things even less diverse because you've got these pockets of like female leadership boards and they kind of follow the executive around on their move. It's really interesting.
I also think, it is perversely this issue, and probably women listeners think it's not an issue. This is good. This is a good thing, but to the extent that this is perceived as an issue by men, it's perversely more of an issue for industries or jobs or positions where women traditionally have been underrepresented. So, in a workplace environment where it is 50-50, it's always been 50-50, and like it hasn't had this historical issue, then it's actually probably as easy as it's ever been for a man to succeed. And there's probably no change, right? They're experiencing very much business as usual. But it's in certain sectors and certain fields where there has been gender imbalances, where upper management are actively trying to address those imbalances. And that's where it's harder. There's a penalty for like people or hiring managers, for example. There's a penalty for hiring managers getting another bloke, right? And that's something that can, over time, weigh up to the disadvantage of good male candidates, right? We all know about certain professions where there's politics is probably a good example, right? Where, like getting pre-selected, like good female candidates into, to run for pre-selection. Well, if you've got 20 really ambitious, members of Young Liberal or Young Labour who've been going at it since the age of 16, and then suddenly this 35-year-old woman who joined the party a year ago gets the silver run to pre-selection. They don't like that, right? Because it's sort of it ignores everything they've put into into
cut your teeth. No, it's true, and sometimes you hear those words like, "Oh, I'm glad this woman got the job because there are enough of you men at the top." It's like all these men, or like we as men or white corporate men, are not in some weird trust fund where we benefit from the CEO's salary or the board's salary. Like we have an Anglo card, and it gets passed around in some kind of dividend. So it's just just another way that life's not fair, and in some ways it's not meant to be, right? It's just about timing. It's about what part of the cycle you're in, and you just gotta do what you gotta do.
we should acknowledge all of the different ways that women get screwed too, right? So they're usually the one expected to be, at least for a period, the primary caregiver of children. They don't necessarily fit into the boys' club, like where there's still this cultural element, like very, blokey cultural element, and there's, the old trope of like the golf days or whatever. Like there's lots of ways they get screwed. So I just, just to be clear what we're saying, what we're not saying.
Yeah, admitting is the first step, Andy. All right, let's go to one that's near and dear and close to my heart, and that is the change in fatherhood expectation, right? So, I think being parents, the transition from just being, a single person, a childless couple to functional parents is probably one of the steepest learning curves. It's one of the most defining moments that will actually have the ability to change your character, and change a lot of things in your life, waistline included. And I think that putting aside equality and whether it's good or bad, there has been a huge shift in the responsibility of fathers when it comes to raising kids. Like that's clear. In some ways, it's indisputable that there is much more load on men nowadays for a large variety of reasons. Now, I'm not saying casting judgment on whether that's good or bad. I think it is good, but it has to be acknowledged that you've just put a whole bunch of work on the menu. Where is that capacity coming from in a traditional sense, right? So I think that if you can get yourself to admit that without trying to first chime in, oh, thank God, or that's how it should be, or this, that, and the other, then you can start to kind of understand the impact, I suppose, on the way that men's lives have been traditionally structured and what the expectation of them is now. So when you look at, say, our father's generation and maybe even a bit older, you can see that there was just a lot more time for men to do things as, well, let's call them just male pursuits, right? And you could see that as a frivolous waste of time, and some of it probably was, spending hours down at the pub or betting at the track or, whatever it is, right? You could put it all under that barrier, under that umbrella of just frivolous social male time, or you could kind of understand that some of those elements served a very important purpose in a man's life and even in a community's kind of well-being as well. And so I think that, it's a very complex picture, and all I'm saying is the first step is that there is more work and expectation on men for fathers, being fathers. Do I think that that is a good thing and is fair? Yes, I do. Do I think that society has a hard time acknowledging the downsides of that and where the time has come from and what that's cost men? Yes, I do, right? And I think that is an interesting conversation that is hard to have.
Do you know, I was, I read this article recently about, I saw in the news recently about how The Simpsons killed off one of its characters, and after how many years, 35 years or whatever. And so, who have they killed off, right? Thinking, so they killed off, I think, I can't remember his name, Larry or something, but it was one of the guys who had no role, really in the series, but to be in Moe's Tavern with Homer, next to Barney, I think he usually sat. And it did get me...
You mean Lenny and Carl?
No, not Lenny and Carl. They had proper roles, but this was one of the level down from Lenny and Carl, right? Yeah, so this was just one of these drunk guys in Moe's Tavern, right? And they killed him off, right? But it did get me thinking about this, and this is what in some ways is a good cultural relic of The Simpsons, because it's old enough now that it really does show, because the personality and identity of Homer and Marge as a couple is pretty fixed, right? It's been fixed for 35 years, right? They're the same age, so it's a bit of a time capsule from what life was 35 years ago and what expectations in a marriage was 35 years ago. Yeah. And the whole thing of Homer going to the pub every day after work and getting drunk, and then there's every other bloke doing the same thing, and they all know each other because they go there every day. Was that ever a thing? Was that actually a real thing that happened? I mean,
yeah, man.
like I know, like I know I go out after work every now and then, so it's not like it hasn't gone away, but like obviously this is like kind of goes hand in hand with like increasing female participation in the workforce, and it's a necessary thing. And also I think there's like it's like an evolving thing where like men and women have started to kind of get the memo, or at least men have started to get the memo that they should be doing, like, it should be fair, like it should be, there's not like a role for women and a role for men. And I think a lot of the historical, disparities in terms of what men and women did at home in terms of child rearing and chores and things like that came out of a notion that men and women were different and had different jobs innate to their gender. And I think that kind of went out the window when women started to enter the workforce. So then it becomes like more a question of, well, in terms of like hours in, hours out, it has to be fair. And I think it's maybe, I guess what I would say is the flip side, maybe to counter what you're saying. The flip side of what you're saying is like, where's the time gone for men? Or like there's time gone for men and we don't acknowledge that impact. I suppose for women, the flip side is, well, they're now expected to work either a part-time or full-time job, probably full-time job, plus still do all the chores that they used to do. And maybe they get a little bit more help from men. But they're probably doing more than what they were doing, before, right? Because they're working, plus they're doing all the things. And then if they've got a good partner, that partner will take up some of the slack, right?
So what I'm trying to kind of put at the feet of you and the listeners is that trying to get you to the space where you agree that there's been a piece of men's time that have evaporated, especially in early childhood, due to fair but changing expectations on men and their participation in that phase. It's about saying, if you can agree that, what are the good parts of what we've lost? Because, there absolutely is a line, some kind of correlation in my mind between the reduction of social time from male-to-male counterparts and this idea of what could be considered modern therapy. Like the therapeutic benefits of men spending time with other men, especially in a conversationally heavy environment like a pub or something like that. Right now, I'm not saying alcohol has to be involved or anything. I'm just trying to draw out, like, if you can get there without being so triggered that men are complaining about they don't have enough time to have beers with the boys, to understand that perhaps there might be a correlation between those parts of male lives disappearing and then mental health issues increasing. And like you said, male suicide, male depression is already much higher than women. Maybe depression not. I wouldn't kind of claim to know exactly the figures. But that to me is like a part of a tricky conversation that's worth having, right? Because also every married couple will tell you that there's a point in time somewhere after childhood that the wife turns around to the husband and says, you don't have any friends. you don't have any friends. You don't do anything, right? And I think that there are things, these are things that we lost in the fire, right? These are things that we didn't understand how they work, because men are very resourceful. They find out how to solve the problem, but they can't articulate exactly what they did to do it. And I think play, socializing, all these activities, there's a lot of elements in that I think that we've thrown away before we even understood or were able to articulate the value and pass that on. That's my view.
All right. My next one can build on this a little bit, which is that, there's very little recognition of like men's needs, right? And how their emotional needs and in different settings, like compared to women, right? So I think I think women's needs are sort of put on a pedestal as like very virtuous things, right? As like these are virtuous things that, and particularly like in the dynamic of like, the typical like relationship between men and women, right? In a domestic sense, right? Like a man satisfying the emotional needs of a woman is seen in a very virtuous way, right? But there's not a lot of thought that goes into what the flip side of that is in terms of what men need, because usually a man not meeting the emotional needs of a woman is in some ways him is it reflects where there's disparities between the emotional needs of the man, right?
Yeah.
And the classic example would be, I think on average men do need a lot more either pure alone time to do things that they're focusing on, or they need, like, whether it's a hobby or whatever, or that kind of, like, well, we've talked about it in the context of like time in the pub or whatever, but like blokes get into all sorts of things, right? Whether like carpentry, for example, right? Having that as a hobby is seen purely through the lens of away time from a partner, right? Which is seen in a negative light. But actually, I think these hobbies and these things that men tend to have more of than women are actual kind of needs, you know. Like, I don't think they're just like choices that men make. I think they need it to. There's something innate about having that, right? And because particularly where there's a tension between the two, from the perspective of one versus the other, like it's always like the women needs are seen as like virtuous, and the men's needs are seen as like that's you being selfish or something, right?
This is a really, really good one, and I think it's also one that it's really hard to talk about, because when you're saying this, sometimes your partner only hears, "I want a break. I want time apart from you. I want distance. I want." It's like, it's very, very hard to hear. And this says more about the nature of modern relationships and how codependent they are, and how closely linked we are. And Esther Perel, says a lot of things about this. The fact that, in a weird way, as we co-inhabit and codependency forms, and the more we know about each other, the less kind of thrill there is, because there's no mystery anymore between. There's no room to even build up new mystery, because you're just downloading, every day and staying in sync. And, every couple is different. I'll grant you that. But I do think you're right. I think it's this idea that men do really crave some kind of hobby or time. And I think that in most cases it is a bid for connection with other men. This idea of like platonic connection. And I think that we've lost that idea a lot, as especially family men. And I think that even hobbies, in a way, are bids for platonic connection, because you do a hobby in most cases, not all, because you want to meet like-minded people, and it creates that buffer, that fluidity for you to connect with them without being hyper-emotional, that suits the boundaries of masculinity, right? It's much easier for men to connect over sport or, like I said, carpentry, a men's shed, or whatever it is, than it is just to get together and go, hey, this is a play date. Do you like me? I like you. Can we hang out more? It's just a bit easier to come in left of center for men, right?
You flick my balls, I'll flick yours.
Yeah. The spot. And yeah, so I tend to agree. I think that's always there. And I think that it's just, again, hard to talk about, because women can interpret that as you don't like them. Like, I mean, and it is fair, right? Like you're saying, you want more time away from me. Like, I thought that spending time with me is your leisure time, right? And it's like, yes, that is good, but there's also another part of me that actually wants to achieve these things just because that's what I want to do, right? Like, that's because that's what draws me, is what, there's a want there, right? And I think that's kind of speaks to men can be attracted to different things than women, and whether that's a socialization thing or whatever, I'm willing to have that conversation. But yeah, it's true.
I don't know if you watch Married at First Sight, but you probably
don't watch any reality TV. Sorry, we've had this conversation. I can't even bring my mind to the fact that you watch reality TV. So,
well, there's too much time that to waste watching that stuff. But anyway, the reason I thought of it was because they're basically putting two people together to figure out if they can build a relationship, and it's so interesting to see how, like, the male perspective and the female perspective in the context of these relationships, because the expectations for the women tend to be very precise and specific, like in terms of what they think should be happening right now in the context of trying to build a relationship. And it's usually around things like having like time together and spending time together and affection and all those sorts of things. And then you see the men often pushing, like you can just tell, like they're just so frustrated. They're just so like, it's just overwhelming for them, and they can't deal with it. And you can just see they're frustrated because they know there's no way they can voice how they're really truly feeling without coming out looking like the arsehole and the bad guy, right? Because you've got there's just no way that they can say, oh, look, I just need some time away from you. Like, I just need some time. We're not together. Like, there's no way they can say that without coming off looking really horrible, right? And they're being filmed by cameras too, this whole experience. But it's such a common thing on that show. And then the women take it so personally, and they get so offended when something of that nature gets said. And I just think that for me just says it all, right?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And I'll just leave it here that if you do find the right person, it makes it easier, right? And I'm not getting poetical about that. There literally is a right person that makes that easier for everyone. I'm going to go to something a bit more lighthearted, and we won't have to dwell on this. But hey, it's hair. Like, the biggest difference. So, you know, when you see older couples and the man looks like dog shit, ugly and old, and the woman still kind of looks normal, that's because men age terribly. And the big part of that, and the psychological part of that, is balding, right? Like, there's this omnipresent fear and loathing of balding for men, right? And yeah, if you're bald and you lose your hair in your kind of mid-20s, you embrace it and you pretty much live your whole life with this identity of being, like a Michael Klim-esque character, But for most men, losing your hair, or the very, very slow process of losing your hair, is this punch in the face every morning, right? It's this kind of looking in the mirror, oh, okay, it's going a bit further back, it's getting a bit thinner, and you just start to lose your identity of what you thought you looked like, right? Like, right before your eyes, it literally falls out, right? And I think that, again, when men complain about that, oh, you're vain, this, that, get over it, just shave it, do all this stuff. But, like, I think there is something that really sucks about that actually it's something that most men will have to deal with, that they will lose their hair. And don't give me this shit that some people look better with it. No. Like, you literally, there are some people that can pull it off better than others and not look like a skinhead or like an old Chinaman, but it's you, you just look so different without your hair.
I think you'd find every woman listening to what you just said would say that is so not true. Women face that every day.
Not with their hair.
Not with their hair, but every new wrinkle they get, or any like this. And I do think, like, sorry, I'm going to push back a little bit. I do think the effects of aging are more significant for women because of two reasons. Firstly, I think that for women, there is, for better or worse, more tied up in their physical appearance in terms of like a dividend. Like, I think historically women, like particularly those who pride themselves on their appearance, like this is like a very core part of their identity, or their pride in themselves that slowly dissipates. So even though it's the same for men in what you've said, but a lot of men could just say, oh, well, I'm losing my hair, but hey, I've still got a good career. I've still got all these, like, it's these other things that they actually get more of their status from, or they feel their identity related more to those things than
I'll grant you that.
Hair, right?
I'll grant you that. Like, but I'm specifically talking about balding, like losing the hair on your head. And look, my sister who went through a cancer diagnosis and things, it is traumatic when women lose their hair. And I grant you on all this stuff. I'm kind of saying that specifically about the balding, and adjacent to that is the reminder of your mortality every time you lose more hair, right? That you are getting older. I think there are different beauty standards for men and women, but let me tell you, not all men age like a fine red wine, like a George Clooney or someone like that, right? Like, what's waiting for most men is not that. It's like, and that's why you see, and there's so many other things women can do to to kind of bring that up to code, whether it's dyeing their hair, whether it's wearing makeup, whether it's getting, cosmetics and things like that, therapy's done. Men just kind of lay it all out.
Yeah, I'm still not sure I'm completely sold by this, right? Because I think and this could be seen as like a misogynist sort of statement by some, but I do think like the peak of sexual attraction or like sexual attractiveness for women is like much younger, like way younger than for men. And for men, there's different ways, like yes, not every man turns out like, a George Clooney, like aging in that sense, but like where men don't age in that way, it's usually because they've given up, because they don't give a fuck anymore, right? Like, and they've put on weight and they, but the fact remains they can, like if they go to the gym and they do all the things that are within their span of control, they could look, pretty good, right? Because they're mature, they might look successful, they might, all of those things, right? But it's not necessarily the same for women. Like once you reach a certain point, like it's like you're older, you don't look young anymore. Like there's no amount of Botox you can have to change that, right? And then it becomes like all of those things you've talked about, like in terms of things women can do. Like even the sign of having those things is itself a sign of aging, right? It's like, because it's not like you can't tell that some work's been done, right?
No, look, I agree with you, but I want to bring you back to the fact that when you lose all the hair on your head, you look like a completely different person. All right, that's what I'm talking about here, like the identity. And I know beauty standards is another thing. I'm not
have
saying
to wear a hat. That's why you wear a hat, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, I don't have any more because you stole my thunder on my spider one.
So I guess the real question, Andy, is if our partners ever listen to this, how are they going to respond?
Well, the irony is I know my partner doesn't listen to this.
This will be the one time she does.
And if she does, I can say, well, if you'd listened, maybe I need to do some tips.